That's just going to get returned. All right. Of its own colonial empire, in the sense that she had allowed these black people to feel the contrast between freedom in the metropoles and slavery within the colonies. Padmore, it seems, despite his vigorous opposition to British imperialism, shared McCohen's enthusiasm for the metropole. He was also impressed by the liberal traditions of what he had learned as a Marxist to identify as bourgeois democracy. The same man, we are told, who in 1931 detailed the exploitation, bloody deeds, and hypocrisy of the empire in Africa and the Caribbeans in his The Life and Struggle of Black Toilers, they use the N-word, was also capable of exclaiming to McCohen a near reckless admiration. The security people, they know we are here. They come into our offices pretending to be buying books or magazines. And sometimes when we're returning from a trip to Russia, they hold us back after crossing the channel. But you can joke with them and say, quote, "We've just been across to get some Russian gold, and we're coming back to enrich the old country," end quote. Instead of giving you the American cattle prod treatment, they laugh at it. They laugh it off. Of course, it was a delusion. It was all delusion. There was, in 1930, little that was quaint or liberal about British politics or generous about the British state. While it was true that in small niche of British society, the Popular Front and its Third International allies flourished, that radical writers and artists could produce political and literary journals such as Storm, Cambridge Left, The Left Review, New Verses, and others, that such weeklies as the Tribune or Claude Cockburn's the Week could be published, that the Left Book Club could be organized in drama groups alike, like Unity Theater and the Group Theater could perform the mass mobilization like the Unemployed of the Jarrow Crusade 1936 could demonstrate, and thousands volunteers in the Spanish Civil War, International Brigade, some 2,762 were thought to have gone to Spain, 1,762 wounded, 534 killed. It was also true that power in British society was being employed for other things. In the streets, Sir Oswald Mosley, tens of thousands of British Union fascists, enacted a terrible physical troll of anti-fascists and destroyed shops like those in London's Mill End Road, owned by Jewish people. Julian Simmons recalled, quote, "Certainly the police force, never notably sympathetic towards left-wing movements, seemed always to assume very readily the task of protecting the fascists from opposition. But the official faces of British police were no less venal. In 1936, it is Edinburgh Conference, the Labour Party had, quote, turned its back on the needs of Republican Spain, end quote. And even earlier, the national government embarked on the neutralists' course between fascist states and their victims. Yet, the same state had no pretensions towards neutrality where its empire was concerned. Black activists in Britain and in the 1930s were subject to the same, quote, heavy manner as Caribbean indigenous people would say. It was their predecessors, just as in the 1920s, Muhammad Ali Daoust had been, quote, constantly trailed by MI15, by Scotland Yard, the agents of the Colonial Police Office, and Claude McKay listened in the files of the British Secret Service, was prevented from returning to Jamaica decades after his single year, 1919 to 1921, of radical journalism in England. British intelligence and the Colonial Office had taken notes of Padmore as early as 1931 and proceeded to neutralize his work in Africa. In the Caribbean, particularly during the workers' strikes of 1937 and 38, black activists was ruthlessly suppressed. And when the Second World War followed, many of these subversivists were duly interned. But the delusion of the liberalism of which McCohen and Padmore spoke was also self-delusion, a piece of a large misconception. To them, and many of their fellows, England, the Second England, the meritocratic, I can't say it, England of romance novels and wing history. It's meritocracy, but it's meritocratic, I can't say it. England of romance novels and Whig history was the embodiment of fair play and deep moral regulation. It was the ideal then that even the most committed anti-imperialists among them found difficulty to shake. Not even the gross imperfections and racism they confronted in the metropole dissuaded them. It was as though they had come to accept that as black Englishmen, a part of their political mission was to correct the errant motherland. Of all of them, it was James who could come closest to understanding why this was so. Doubtlessly, it was his comprehension of English society. Okay, have to appeal again. You're not gonna fucking accept my appeal. Stop doing it. Closest to understanding why this was so. Doubtlessly, it was his comprehension of English society that provided him with the insight into British imperialism, British liberalism, and British left. On this score, he would proceed far beyond the economism of Engels and Marx and many of the most recent British Marxists. Perhaps one reason for James's less euphoric reaction to English society was that his introduction to the country had differed in important way from those of McCohen and Padmore. Living in Lancaster with Larry and Norman Constantine, physically remote from the more typical site of middle-class radicalism and organized politics, James was enveloped by a more contemplative work and more mundane politics. Through Constantine, to be sure, he had gained access to a Manchester Guardian and was soon substituting for Neville Cordes, a paper's cricket correspondent. But his major preoccupation, the collaboration with Constantine on cricket, and the public lectures of the Caribbean indigenous, the editing of the life of Captain Carprinian provided him the opportunity to read Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, to review the lie of labor politics in Britain, and to meet the British worker for discussion removed from superheated circumstances. Indeed, we could later admit that the development of his critical stance regarding the Labour Party, with which he had identified as a Carpinian nationalist, was due to discussion with Lancashire workers that brought discredit on the party's leadership. Quote, my labor and socialist ideas had been got from books, and were rather abstract. These humorously cynical working men were a revelation, and brought me down to earth, apparently sharing their disillusionment with the Labour Party, and soon found the alternative. I know it's not approved. Yeah, whatever. I read the history of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky, because I was very much interested in the history of the book seemed to offer some analysis of modern society. At the end of reading the book, spring 1934, I became a Trotskyist. In my mind, and later joined, I was clear in my mind that I was not going to be a Stalinist. He did talk about that in the book I'm reading. But again, I want to reiterate, he moved from Trotskyism, I promise you. It was for this political base and ideology that he would write World Revolution, 1917 to 1934, The Rise of the Fall of the Communist International in 1937, and translate Boris Sovereignin Stalin in 1938. It was as a Trotskyist that James would author The Black Jacobins, the work for which he is best known, first published in 1938. This still formidable study of the Haitian and French Revolution, and their signification for British abolitionism. Sorry, everybody. Was one of the same time an analysis of the relationship between revolutionary masses and leadership, and an attempt to establish a historical legacy of African revolutionary struggle. Within the same volume, it was not difficult to unearth a critique of Stalinism, an expression of Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution, and the elaboration of Lenin's theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, all constructed upon Marx's extraordinary determination of the I don't know what they're referring, the primitive. That is the imperialist accumulation of capital. It was from the beginning recognized as a extraordinary work. We will return to it shortly. However, it was a second turn of consciousness that provided James with the perspective of English society, that developed the development of his recounted in Beyond a Boundary, James' most exquisite statements on British imperialism and the development of English bourgeoisie society, published in 1936. It was a sort of autobiographic study. Civilian Winters was called it an auto-sociographical system, ostensibly to the game of cricket. Here, James advocated his interest into his interest into English society as a proper member of the English middle class, steeped in the public school code. His memory of being a black person, but they use boy, sorry everybody, at Queen's Royal College in Trinidad, characterizes the bourgeois mortality and rationalism to which he and his fellow colonials were introduced. Inside the classroom, the code had little success. Sneaking was taboo, but we lied and cheated without any sense of shame. I know I did. But as soon as we stepped on the cricket or football field, more particularly the cricket field, all was changed. We learned to obey the umpire's decisions without question. However irrational it was. We learned to play with the team, which meant subordinating your personal inclinations and even interest to the good of the whole. We kept a stiff upper lip in that we did not complain about ill fortune. We did not denounce failure, but well tried or hard luck came easily to our lips. We were generous to opponents and congratulated them on victories, even when we knew they did not deserve it. On the playing field, we did what ought to be done. Cricket, he writes, became more of his obsession. He played it, he read about it, and in time, as we have noted, he came to write about it. In a way, his youth was dominated by the game of cricket, was the means of his introduction to the island's brown middle class, and selected his personal friends. It grounded his perception of manhood and the judgment he would make. of other men. And eventually, through Constantine, it became the reason for his coming to England. His other obsession was literature. This, too, was an emancipation of the English bourgeoisie. For James, it had begun with William Makepeace Thackeray. Thackeray. Quote, I laughed without sanctity at Thackeray's constant jokes and sneers, and Gibbs at the aristocracy, and at people in high places. Thackeray, not Marx, bears the heaviest responsibility for me. After Thackeray, Ray, there was Dickens, George Eliot, and the whole bunch of English novelists. Followed the poet of Matthew Arnold selections, Shelley, Keats, and Byron, Milton, and Spencer. I discovered criticism, Hazlitt, Lamb, and Coleridge, Saintsbury's, and Goose. Burke led me to the speeches, Canning, Lord Brougham, John Bright. But the two, cricket and English literature, were complements. Each of them, as he was to discover in England, were cultural and ideological expressions of the same social order, a bourgeoisie order grounded on capitalism, systemized in the 19th century by Thomas Arnold's philosophy of the public school, tortured by the moral persuasion of Thomas Hughes, and embodied in the play of W.G. Grace, the cricketer, yeah. The game and its place in the social history of England told it all. It was created by a yeoman farmer, the gamekeeper, the potter, the tinker, the Nottingham coal miner, the Yorkshire factory hand. These artisans made it men of hand and eye, rich and idle young noblemen, and some substantial city people contributed money, organization, and prestige. The class of the population that seems to have contributed least was class disdained and appropriate the game and convert it into a national institution. This was the solid Victorian middle class. It was accumulating wealth. It had won its first political victory in the Reform Bills of 1832, and it would win its second with the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. It was on its way. More than most newcomers, it was raw. The Victorian middle class read Dickens, loved Dickens, worshipped Dickens, as few writers have been before or since. It is a very bold assumption that they did not understand what Dickens was saying. Dickens saw Victorian England always with the eyes of a pre-Victorian. His ideal England was the England of Hazlitt, of Pickwick, man of genius as he was. The Victorians were more pre-spacious than he. Did I say that right?
I don't know. I don't know.
Pre-spacious, yeah, than he. We're not looking backwards. They wanted a culture, a way of life of their own. They found it symbolized for them in the work of the three men. First, in Thomas Arnold, the famous headmaster of rugby. Secondly, in Thomas Hughes, the author of School Days. And lastly, in W.G. Grace. These three men more than all others created Victorianism. And to leave out Grace is to misconceive the other two. Cricket and football was organized game, had begun as an expression of the artistic instincts of the English world and artisan classes. Had James had available to him what E.P. Thompson was concurrently formulating in the making of the English working class, what might be mistaken for coincidence if one were not aware that both James and Thompson were Marxist historians. Both were responding to the recent experience of profound political disillusionment. For James, his defeat at the hands of Eric Williams upon his return to Trinidad. For Thompson, his resignation from the British Communist Party, he reckoned morally and politically comatose. Oh, I don't know this word. Do you know this word? What?
Comatose.
Oh, comatose, yeah, by Stalinism. And both were, in Thompson's word, quote, attempting to defend and re-examine the extent of the Marxist tradition at a time of political and theoretical disaster. He would have had no reason to hesitate in assigning this emergency of organized games to the process of working class formation in England. These games were particularly their organization and their pre-industrial spirit, untainted by a serious corruption, end quote, where one aspect of the culture of mediation constructed by the working classes as a response to the historical process of capitalist dislocation, expropriation, and the deepening alienation. James, however, could only hint a comprehension of that signification. Quote, when the common people were not at work, one thing they wanted was organized sports and games, end quote. The reflexive logic of his own development drew his attention elsewhere. He focused his analysis on that game, on the games came to signify for the ruling classes, the classes whose capacity for literary and philosophical articulations had done so much to form his own consciousness. For James, the starting point for understanding the English ruling classes and their hegemony over the laboring classes at home and abroad was in historical parallel. He discovered between ancient Greece in the 19th century, 20th century Imperial Britain, it was a neutral place for him to begin his British. He was British and Greco-Roman. We are, end quote. In both societies, he recognized the relationship that fused power and organized games, an almost fanatical obsession with athletic sentiment. And he wrote of the Greeks to the assertion of, quote, the national unity of Greek civilization and the consciousness of themselves as separate from the barbarians who surrounded them. The first recorded date in European history in 776 BC, the date of the first Olympic Games. The Greek state made unceasing war against one another. But then, when the four yearly games approached, they declared the national truce. The various competitors assembled at Olympia. The games were held, and when these were over, the war began again. So every Greek city and every colony, as far away as Italy, Sicily, Africa, Egypt, and Marseilles, the envoys went from Olympia with its invitations, and the community sent their representatives and their official deputations. For thousand pilgrims would assemble, including the most distinguished members of Greek society. But James insisted the whole spectacle and its apparent but deceptive parallel in British society require close analysis. Such an inspection would reveal the subtle dialectic between culture and the exercise of domination. The game was not introduced into Greece by a popular democracy. In fact, when the democracy came into power, it lifted another type of celebration, the tragic drama of a position of eminence to which the games soon took second place. The Olympic Games had been a festival of the feudal aristocracy and the bourgeoisie of Greece. Only the bourgeoisie had the money to stand the expenses of the competitors. Only the aristocratic families were in a position to take part in the chariot races. In England, organized sports had been a mass phenomenon, a spontaneous and public creation. And then, just as with land and labor, the rising bourgeoisie had expropriated it for their own purpose. Undisciplined, vulgar, and lacking self-confidence, they had sensed that their reliance on naked force in their persona as expropriators, exploiters, and imperialists would ultimately destroy them if they could not establish to their own satisfaction their right to rule. They wanted a culture, a way of life of their own, quote unquote. Arnold believed in religion, and he believed in character. Scarcely less powerful in his conception was the role of the intellect. The English ruling class accepted Arnold's aims and accepted also his methods in general. But with an unerring instinct, they separated from it the cultivation of the intellect and substitution for its organized games, with cricket at the heart of the curriculum. Yeah, no, thank you. The public school and its regime, or organized games, and athleticism, provided them with a way of life. John Ray, himself a headmaster, concurs. Athleticism was a complex phenomenon at the heart of which was a belief that compulsory competitive games identified and developed qualities of character that were admirable in themselves, and not only the public school system, but also those areas in British and imperial societies where public school men played the leading roles. By 1900, the original rationale for organized games had been long forgotten. The athleticism had developed its own ideological justification. Games not only postponed the mental torment of sex, they taught a morality. They developed manlines and toughness, without which an expanded empire could not be run. They encouraged patriotism as the fierce loyalty of house to house and school was transferred to the regiment and the country. Kind of like what they do with like American sports here. You gotta, yeah. Though it might be said, quote, by it a ruling class discipline and trained itself for the more supple and effective exercise of power. James believed such an interpretation was too mechanistic, too much the clever manipulation, too much the literal translation of what Arnold had intended. The psychological expression of the emergent English bourgeoisie had been drawn from the historical and character and cultural materials within which it had generated. James preferred to see the forms of their hegemony as extracted from a movement of the national culture, a renewal of English life drawings on the Puritan past, but universal enough to affect other peoples far removed from its origins. This signifies, as so often in any deeply national movement, that it contained elements of universality that went beyond the bounds of the originating nations. It would be, he maintained, the only contribution that English education would make to the general educational ideas of Western civilization. He was not as sure or as clear as he might have been in the company of Thompson of the process he termed modern civilization, quote unquote. But he did reveal one of its consequences. The English ruling class bourgeoisie at first had acquired a discipline from themselves for their own raison d'etre and reproduction. They found their instrument among the cultura, goods produced by the working classes. What they extracted or embedded in athleticism were rules of class, moral values, and utilitarian rationalism. What they shared in the social spectacle of the games became part of the cement that bonded the several social orders into an identical imperial mission, one that would include even those natives at the peripheries whose claim to an English identity would amount to a tragic mistake. In the absence of more telling evidence, we must surmise that James discovered that mistake in England 30 years before he sat down to write beyond a boundary. When James and his contemporaries appeared in the metropoles in the 1920s and 1930s, the England in which they had been immersed had already passed. Indeed, except in the airy fantasies manufactured by the ruling class and their intelligentsia, it may never have existed. Among those elements that truly made a difference, the working classes were becoming detached from their identification with the bourgeoisie and the nobility. English workers were militantly demonstrating that they were no longer persuaded that their future and that the ruling class were identical. Their betrayal by capitalism manifested in the millions of unemployment made many, for the moment, no longer willing to fight imperialist wars. By the mid-1930s, their declared interests could be found in demonstrations like the Hunger March in 1934 and the Jarrah Crusade of 1936. And they formed into militant grassroots groups like the National Employment Workers, movements where numbers swelling even the membership figures of the CPGB. In 1 year, 1935 to 36, the party went from 7,000 to 11,500. The material crisis of world capital, the political incompetence of the ruling classes, despite the repeated betrayal by the leadership of the Labour Party and the trade union movement, provided a basis for a certain regeneration of the formal working class movement and its electoral aspects. Memberships in the trade unions expanded, and the Labour Party, in disgrace in 1931, made substantial gains, as did the CPGB in the municipal election of 1932, 33, and 34, and the general elections of 35. The organized left, however, was not a major beneficiary. For Padmore, McCohen, and their African comrades I.T.H. Wallace, Johnson, and Kayintia, in the anti-imperialist left, there was another difference. Inevitably, even James realized that the illusion of the empire was a global fraternity, benevolently orchestrated by the advanced races for the interests of backward ones, as was at best remote for the actualities they encountered. England, with its ever-broadening, grubby, dark poverty, its low life, fascist actively aligned identity with factions of the ruling classes, its vulgar display of racism, which inexplicably victimizes those among the colonials, who were proudest to being British, and its political mediocrity, inspired contempt, no confidence, the sheer pitness of political discourse and bureaucratic can't portray what one expects from the English heritage, quote unquote, or even from their respected enemies. There were not the actions of pretentious colonial administrators. They were manifestations in the home country itself. And while revolutionary movements of grandeur scale and visions could be seen emerging among backward, quote unquote, peoples in India, Ceylon, China, and Africa, while even the Japanese ruling classes were mounting a massive territorial empire and the Soviet rationalizing one, the left in Britain displayed characteristics of factionalism, ideological toadism, and a politics dishonorably disdained from the working classes and their struggles, abandoning, as Pradmore believed, by their most powerful ally, the world communist movement, thoroughly disgusted with the duplicity of imperial policies, they turned towards the black radical tradition. But they did not remove themselves from Marxist thought. I want to make that evidently. Any questions before we move on to the next section? Jojo?
I was thinking, I don't know. I don't know. I kind of had a question, but like I think you kind of answered it, so I think we're cool.
Okay. The Theory of the Black Jacobin is a book about the Haitian Revolution that he wrote, that C.L.R. James wrote. In the 30s, we're rich in political dramas that might ground black radical intelligentsia in their own historical traditions. Their indulgence in the militant rhetoric of the Western European left, invoking images of emergent revolutionary lower orders of its own, would have ideologically brought them to it eventually. For in the older sense of the word, who was more proletarian than black people in the imperialist and capitalist order. Sorry. But it was a different, though not unrelated, historical logic that was maturing. They read Du Bois' Black Reconstruction with its invocation of the brilliance of black radicalism in the 19th century America, and they recognize its unmistakable debt to the black masses and the earlier 20th century who had produced the Chilabomwambis, the Garveys, the Lemaine Singors, and the Simin Kimbongas. I hope I'm saying that right. And then in 1934 to 35, when the fascist Italian army invaded Ethiopia, the dam burst. McCohen recalled, it's very important to put the response of the black world to the Ethiopian war into respective, especially since it is easy to get the impression that Pan-Africanism was just some type of petty protest activity. A few black people occasionally meeting in conference and sending resolutions here and there. But the real dimensions can only be gathered by estimating the kind of vast support that Ethiopia enjoyed amongst black people everywhere. We were only one center, the International African Friends of Ethiopia, but the title was very accurate. Later, letters simply poured into our office from black people on 3 continents, asking where could they register. And the same was true of Africa. When the Italians entered Addis Ababa, I think so, it was reported that school children wept in the Gold Coast. It brought home to many black people the reality of colonialism and exposed its true nature. They could see that the stories of Lenin and Trotsky and Sun Yat-sen, which is a communist in China before Mao Zedong, must have their African counterparts. It was clear that imperialism was a force to be reckoned with because it was attacking the black man's last citadel. Within the International African Friends of Ethiopia, however, there were disagreements as to what was to be done. McCohen believed that the collective security of the League of Nations, to which Italy belonged, and paradoxically, through Italy, Ethiopia's membership had been accepted, should be invoked, arguing that it was a chimera unless fascist Italy was stopped. James, who chaired the IAFE, was ambivalent, however. As an international socialist, he accepted the Independent Labour Party's position that all the British and French capitalists were concerned with was using Ethiopia as a pretext for a war to destroy their rivals. The, quote, defense of Ethiopia was a mask for an imperialist war. He opposed the League of Nations and the concession in return for the sanctions against Italy. Its diplomats had extorted from the emperor himself, a feudal reactionary, as a black man. However, he had other imperatives. Yeah. With Garvey and Hyde Park announcing Mussolini as, quote, the arch barbarian of our times, and vigorously urging black people to support Abyssinian, despite the emperor's infamous reluctance at identifying himself as a black man. With the worldwide popular response among black people, James Ground was prescribed. I offer myself through the Abyssinian embassy here to take service under the emperor, military and otherwise. My reason for this were simple. International socialists in Britain fight British imperialism because obviously it is more convenient to do so than fight, for instance, Germany imperialism. But Italian capitalism is the same enemy, only a little further removed. My hope was to get into the army. It would have given me an opportunity to make contact, not only with the masses of the Abyssinians and other Africans, but in the ranks with them. I would have had the best possible opportunity to put across the international socialist case. I believe also that I could have been useful in helping to organize anti-fascist propaganda among the Italian troops. And finally, I would have had an invaluable opportunity of gaining actual military experience on the African field, where one of the most expert battles between capitalism and its opponents is going to be fought for very many years. I did not intend to spend the rest of my life in Abyssinian, but all things considered, I thought and still think that 2 or 3 years there, given the fact that I am a black person, they use the N-word, and I am especially interested in the African Revolution, was well worth the attempt. Obviously, James was in conflict, but by earlier 1936, the situation had resolved itself for the moment. The occupation of Ethiopia was an accomplished fact. The emperor was in exile in Britain. By the end of the year, however, the Spanish Civil War had begun. Now the entire international left was at war, and black people from Africa, the Caribbean, and America joined the international brigades to fight against the fascist forces of Spain, Germany, and Italy. And some black people fought for fascism in Moroccan soldiers, General Franco's stormtroopers. But even before the international brigades were withdrawn from Spain in 1938 to 39, the Caribbean exploded into strikes and brutal repression. The world seemed enveloped in struggle of black people, and the black struggle were a part of that world. For more radicals, an unavoidable lesson of the era was the necessity for armed resistance to oppression and exploitation. But for James, what the Italian army had done in Ethiopia, the killing of tens of thousands of peasants, and the complicity of the bourgeoisie democracies was instruction enough. Africans and people of Africa descent, especially those who have been imprisoned by British imperialist education, needed a lesson. They have got it. Every succeeding day shows exactly the real motives which move imperialism in its contact with Africa, shows the incredible S-word and duplicity of European imperialism. So I can use that incredible savagery of the duplicity of European imperialism in its quest for markets and raw materials. Let the lesson seek deep. The lesson sank deep. Then he imagined his tutorship under European radical thought had come to an end. From this point of his work would leap beyond the doctrines constructed of an anti-Stalinist left and Engels and Marx themselves. That's not true. The force of he did not abandon Marx's position. The force of black radical tradition, and I know the book. The book is called Celia James, Notes and Dialectics. Hegel, Lenin, Marx and Lenin. So he retreated to find out his line. The forces of the black radical tradition merged with the emergencies of black masses in the movements to form the new theory and ideology in James's writing. In James's view, with only the most sporadic support to expected from the European working classes and the European left, the radical black intelligentsia was now compelled to seek the liberation of their peoples by their own means. But some of the others with whom he was to be associated in the successors of the IAFE, the International African Service Bureau, 1937, did not agree. When Padmore, for example, expressed his own reservations in how Britain rules Africa, James leveled a withering criticism. Here's his criticism. For some reason, I'm just burping up a storm. It is on the future of Africa that the author himself, a man of African descent, is grievously disappointed. He heads one section, Will Britain betray her trust? As if he were some missionary of labor politician. In the true tradition of Lenin, he insisted on the right of the American people to choose their own development.
African people.
But astonishingly, what?
You said American, African.
Thank you. But astonishingly, he welcomes the appeal of enlightened and far-sighted sections of the ruling classes of Europe with colonial interests in Africa to cooperate with Africans. That is wildness. How does the lion cooperate with the lamb? Africans must win their own freedom. Nobody will win it for them. They need cooperation, but that cooperation must be with the revolutionary movement in Europe and Asia. There is no other way out. Each movement will neglect the other at its peril, and there is not much time left. He had not forsaken the anticipation of the industrial proletarian revolution, but he had become aware of the existence of a more vigorous black opposition than that with which he was familiar in his own class. In the crushing of the Ethiopian people, he had seen the naked face of Western imperialism. More importantly, however, in Ethiopia, Spain, and the Caribbean, he had witnessed the capacity for resistance of ordinary black people, the transformation of peasants and workers into liberation forces. Unlike Padmore, those sojourn at the pinnacle of international communism had left him uncertain. when he could no longer rely on that source of Chiantin and Williams, whose encounter with the imperial and capitalist metropoles so impressed them as to advise caution. James became convinced that successful armed rebellion among black peoples was possible. The colonial struggle and the metropolitan struggle were identical on that score. For a time, this view prevailed. Armed rebellion among black people became the official position of the IASB. But after 1938, with James away in America on the lecture tour that would last for 15 years, that stand was modified by his associates. The work of the Bureau continued all through the war, and in 1945, there came a sharp break with the theory. The Bureau changed its position from the achievement of independency by armed rebellion to the achievement of independency by nonviolent black mass action. But to say that is one thing, to carry it out by practice is another. To stake independence upon armed rebellion was therefore to have as a precondition the collapse of military paralysis of the metropolitan government. It was, in other words, a place initiative for African struggle upon European proletariat. But by the end of the war, the proletariat of Britain and France had not spoken. Imperialism still held sway at home. All the radical alterations in theory could form the basis for action. The perspective of armed rebellion was abandoned, though held in reserve. The nonviolent mass action was substituted. While they pinned their hopes on the disintegrative force that war represented for the empires, on the resurrection of liberal ideology expressed by the ruling classes made desperate by that war, and on the political consequences of the practical support given by the colonials to the imperial countries during the war, James immersed himself in the American Trotskyist movement and struggled for black workers. And he too became recounseled in nonviolent action. As a result of the war, the revolution and crises which had shaken contemporary society to its foundation for almost 40 consecutive years, the bourgeoisie had lost its self-confidence in the face of a united mass of movement. When all is said and done, the new political directive, breaking with the well-established ideas of the pre-war period, is one of the great theoretical achievements of the present age, perhaps the first real break towards what the Marxist movement requires today, the application of traditional principles of Marxism in complete independence of the Stalinist perversion. It is to the note that the theory did not reject armed rebellion, but held it in reserve in the event that the political and moral pressures and vestige failed to influence British imperialism. But nonviolent mass action threw the black struggle back into the hands of the petite bourgeoisie, albeit a radical petite bourgeoisie. It was they who would mediate between the mass movement and the representatives of the imperialism. And neither James nor any of the others ever came to terms with this theoretical error. It was simply the case that demanded for the right of black people to govern themselves, the position adopted at the Fifth Pan-African Congress in Manchester, 1945, articulated by the radical intelligentsia, speaking on behalf of the dominated, would have historical consequences, quite different from those that resulted from the black masses seized their liberation. Nevertheless, James' intervention had been significant. He had made a singular contribution to radical black historiography when he and his comrades in the IASB were mapping out their contending positions in the last years of the third and during the fourth decade of the century. It was then that Padmore had written How Britain Rules Africa. Eric Williams in the black people in Caribbean, they used the N word for black. Kayente, his Kenyan land of conflict, and James the Black Jacobins. The first three had proposed national independence for African peoples, but were addressed to the colonial powers. The fourth had not appealed. Instead, it was a declaration of war of liberation. Those black Haitians, laborers, and the biracial peoples have given us an example to study. The imperialist vestige of eternity of African exploitation. The African was not, but they say it backward, arrogant. They dream dreams. The theoretical framework of Black Jacobins was, of course, the theories of revolutions developed by Marx, Engels, and Lenin and Trotsky. James asserts that fact rather frequently in the text. It was not, however, entirely the case. For Marx and Engels, he had taken the concept of a revolutionary class and the economic foundation for its historical emergence. But the slaves in Haiti were not a Marxian proletariat. I would say most proletariats are not Marxians, to be honest with you. No matter to James, the process of social formation were the same. The slaves worked on the land, and like revolutionary peasants everywhere, they aimed at the extermination of their oppressors, but working and living together in gangs of hundreds of huge sugar factories, which covered the North Plain. They were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time. The rising was, therefore, and thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. Moreover, James seemed willing to challenge Marx and Engels on the very grounds that had laid for the sociological and political significance of early capitalism. While they had been content to locate the formation of the modern revolutionary proletariat at the core of the capitalist industrial production, James was insisting that the spheres be broadened. At the same time as the French masses, the half-esword slaves of San Domingo were showing themselves subject to the same historical laws as the advanced workers of revolutionary Paris. Capitalism had produced its social and historical negation in both poles of its expropriation. Capitalist accumulation gave birth to the proletariat at the manufacturing core. Primitive accumulation deposited the social basis for the revolutionary masses in the peripheries. But what distinguished the formation of these revolutionary classes was the source of their ideological and cultural development. While the European proletariat had been formed through and by the ideas of bourgeoisie, the ruling ideas, Marx and Engels had maintained were the ideas of the ruling class. They were not the ideas. Okay, I'm sorry, Marx and Engels were not the ideas of the ruling class, if that's what they're saying. In Haiti, and presumably elsewhere among the slave population, the Africans had constructed their own revolutionary culture. One does not need education or encouragement to cherish a dream of freedom. At their midnight celebration of voodoo, their African cult, they danced and sang, usually this favorite song, A Bamba, He Hu, Kanga Bafio Ti, Kanga Mo Dili. I can't do this. Kanga Do Kolai, Kangalai. I swear to destroy the whites and all that they possess. Let us die rather than fall to keep this vow. The colonialists knew this song and tried to stamp it out. And the voodoo cult, with which it was linked. In vain, voodoo was a medium and of a conspiracy. In spite of all prohibitions, the slaves traveled miles to sing and dance and practice their rites and talk. And now, since the revolution, to hear the political news and make their plans. This was a complete departure from the way in which Marx and Engels had conceptualized the transformative and rationalizing significance of the bourgeoisie. To imply, it implied, and James did not see this, that bourgeois culture and thought and ideology were irrelevant to the development of revolutionary consciousness among black and other third developing world peoples. It broke with the, now this is, like, okay, so then what do we talk about Amilcar Cabral and all those other people that chose the Marxist path and position? I feel like, I don't know. It broke with the evolutionist change in the close dialectic of historical materialism. No, it didn't. James still utilized it. But where James was to hesitate, Cabral, as we have noted before, would stride boldly forward. National liberation is the phenomenon in which a given socioeconomic whole rejects the negation of its historical process. In other words, the national liberation of a people is to regain the historical personality of that people, its return to history through the destruction of the imperialist domination to which it was subjected. But James, here, can someone remember 400? I can, 400, just real quick.
Okay.
We're hitting 10 minutes. All right, we're good. 400.
Okay.
All right, here we go. But James' effort to level Marxist theory to the requirements of black radical historiography was not finished. Though he bore the great respect for the work and thought of Lenin, there too he suggests a more imaginative treatment, with Lenin's notion of a cadre and professional revolutionists. I'm sorry, but he had a cadre. I'm sorry, but see how James created a cadre.
Okay.
The beginning of the event.
I'm just wondering, like, he's talking about it, and he's calling it historiography, but it's like, if it is Lenin's, it's historical materialism.
Exactly. He's misrepresenting these positions in a sense, I feel. With the Lenin's notion of a cadre and professional revolutionist, the beginning of the vanguard party in mind, James went so far as to designate an entire stratum, described in precise terms how it was formed. Now, James did have a critique of the vanguard system, because James ended up being, I think, a Marxist communizer at the end. Well, I'm going to find out later. I'll find out and I'll report. The leaders of the revolution are usually those who have been able to profit by the cultural advantages of the system they are attacking. This was an omission of class pride, and neither Lenin nor Marx or Engels had been prepared to make. I don't know about that. Though, surely, it was an advertent omission, one that reveals James's own class origins, and also reflecting a certain historical clarity. The petite bourgeois intelligentsias had played dominant roles in Marxism, in Marxist thought, oh my God, as well as in the Bolshevik victory in Russia. The theory and the ideology of revolution was theirs, and unarguably too, the Russian state. They had brought to the working class movement their superior knowledge and the political vices which usually accompany it, as James would say of Toussaint. In San Domingo, the revolutionary masses had found the most propitious? How do you say that word?
Propitious. I don't know.
Let's find out.
Okay, thank you. It's Propitious. Propitious?
Let me say it. It's good omen and giving indications of good things to come, I guess.
Okay.
Figure of Toussaint L. Overture. In that book, James criticizes Toussaint Overture and brings Dessalines into the mix of, like, I don't know. He knew the enemy better than they. That had been one of his rewards as a functionary in the slave system. His post as steward of the livestock had given him experience in administration, authority, and intercourse, and with those who ran the plantation. Men who, by sheer ability and character, find themselves occupying positions usually reserved for persons of a different upbringing, education, and class, usually performed those duties with exceptional care and devoted labor. In addition, he had read Caesar's commentaries, read and reread the long volumes of the Abbé Raynal. He had a thorough grounding in the economics and politics, not only of San Domingo, but of all the great empires of Europe. His superb intellect had therefore had some opportunity of cultivating itself in general affairs at home and abroad. Even though they actually imprisoned him, but at the end, Toussaint had also failed the revolution. James more than sympathizes with some of Toussaint's failures. Toussaint knew the backwardness of the laborers. He made them work, but he wanted to see them civilized and advance in culture. He was anxious to see black people acquire the social deportment of better class whites and their Versaillese manners. He also believed that Toussaint was correct in thinking that the property whites who remained to return to San Domingo were needed to help the former slaves to construct the modern state. His unrealistic attitude to the former masters at home and abroad sprang not from the abstract humanitarianism or loyalty, but from the recognition that they alone had what San Domingo society needed. This last in almost direct contradiction to his belief 30 years later. Slaves ran the plantation, those tremendous plantations, the great source of wealth of so many English aristocrats and merchants, the merchant princes who cut such a figure in English society, and French too. But are speaking of English society, yet others, even more recently, have agreed with the earlier James. In 1938, however, James knew that the former slave Toussaint's contemporaries did not agree. When they acted on those beliefs and rebelled against Toussaint because they were no longer willing to accept his egotistical compromise with the colonial bourgeoisie and the Bonapartist regime in France, because of the bourgeois revolution of getting rid of going into liberalism and capitalism. Toussaint had them hunted down and executed. That tragedy, James argued, was because Toussaint explained nothing and allowed the masses to think that their old enemies were being favored at their expense. Moreover, importantly, James insisted Toussaint's failure had been the result of events beyond his control. If he failed, it is for the same reason that the Russian Socialist Revolution failed, even after all of its achievements and defeats of the revolution in Europe. But James was quite aware that there was much that had been within Toussaint's range, and much that he had botched. He seemed to sense that for all the importance that might be rightly placed in the counter-revolution in Europe, and for all the genius that could be ascribed to Toussaint in the earlier periods of the revolution, there was still something that was terribly wrong in the man's makeup. Indeed, James admits Haitian leaders of much narrower experience and education than Toussaint would overcome difficulties that his psychology could not confront. And in an extraordinary series of paragraphs, he tried to reconcile his admiration for the revolutionary masses that had constructed him, as I would argue, and these figures to whom history attached the contemplation of the Haitian Revolution. These passages, better than most, reveal the sources of James' contradictions in 1938. Between Toussaint and his people, there was no fundamental differences of outlook or of aim. Knowing the race question of the political, knowing the race question for the political and social question, that it was he tried to deal with it in a purely political and social way. It was a grave error. Lenin, in his thesis of the Second Congress of the Communist International, warned the white revolutionaries, a warning they badly needed, that such has been the effect of the policy of imperialism on the relationship between advanced and backwards people, that European communists will have to make wide concessions to natives of colonial countries in order to overcome the justified prejudice which these feel towards all classes in the oppressing countries. Toussaint, as his power grew, forgot that. He ignored the black laborers, bewildered them at every moment that he needed them most, and to bewilder the masses is to strike the deadliest of all blows at the revolution. The whites were whites of the old regime. Dessalines did not care what they said or thought. The black laborers had to do the fighting, and it was they who needed reassurance. It was not that Toussaint had any illusions about the whites. He had none whatever. Yet Toussaint's error sprang from the very qualities that made him that he was. It was easy to see today, as his generals saw after he was dead. There he had erred. It does not mean that they or any of us would have done better in his place. If Dessalines could see so clearly and simply, it was because the ties that bound this uneducated soldiers to French civilization were of the slenderest. He saw what was under his nose so well because he saw no further. Toussaint's failure was a failure in enlightenment, not of darkness. Alas, for no less in authority than James himself, we knew this last defense of Toussaint was not without its elements of rationalization. As Toussaint wasted away in his persons in Jura Mountains, writing his letters and supplications of the little emperor, his vision gave him away. Despite the treachery of France, he still saw himself as a part of a French republic, divisible. He could not think otherwise. There was a limit beyond which he could not go. We of course recognize James and perhaps even his impressions of Padmore. In these assertions, we can see the declared identification of black revolutionary intelligentsia with the masses, the willingness to continue the submission of scientific socialism. By denying the material forces of ideology while indicating a bitter disappointment with the communist movement, the patronizing attitude towards the organic leaders of the masses, and the ambivalent pride of place presumed for the westernized ideology. However, moreover, it is clear that James was looking critically at his own class. Unlike his confederates, he was compelled to face up to the boundaries beyond which the revolutionary petite bourgeoisie could not be trusted. For that reason, he was to insist often that the revolutionary masses must preserve to themselves the direction of the revolutionary movement, never deferring to professional revolutionist parties or the intelligentsia. But we shall return to that in a moment, and we'll stop there, the coming terms with the Marxist tradition. I don't, when he says the coming terms, it makes it sound like James like moved from that position when it's not true. All right. So we'll stop on page 403. Sorry, backwards. Anybody want to come up, talk about it, say anything?
I can't say much because I don't know James's personal views. He made it sound like James was saying Toussaint was everything and Dessalines wasn't something. When I read the book, and I don't, that wasn't what I walked away with.
That's not what I walked away with it either. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I just think that people don't like. They just. I don't know. I think like Marxist being a Marxist is like it's bad omen. It's taboo now. I just don't. I don't understand why. It shouldn't be. What's up, Dooley?
Yeah. I don't know how. I don't know how this book is like some parts are helpful, but like consistently it's like misrepresenting the things it's talking about.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, but this is not as good of a book as it advertises itself to be.
Yeah. I have critiques for sure. You know. But like I said, I'm gonna read Black Reconstruction next because I think that's a cross reference to this book to see what Du Bois really says and what really his conclusions draw him to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah. Because, like, Marxism is adaptable to the conditions and stuff. It's supposed to be. Because it's a science and is ever moving and perpetuating. You know? So, I don't know. But is there anything else anybody wants to talk about? Yeah, 403. 403. 403. 403. Who called me? All right. Well, if no one else has anything to say, how many more pages do we have left? 403. Ooh. Oh, we're getting close. Wait, maybe. We're on 403. Getting close to the end. All right. But I'm guessing no one else has anything to say, and I'm going to reflect on this a little bit and figure out more stuff. You know what I mean? So.
Bye.
What?
I said, love you. Bye.
Bye. What about you, Dooley? Anything before we leave?
Much love. Take care. Sorry, I'm making dinner.
All right. I think that Two Spirit and them are going to do the book reading tonight. That's what I heard last time. So we'll find out. All right, everybody.